Hello, everyone. It's the IDRH DigitalKS podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. I am your host, David Tamez, and on our second episode, we are joined by Dr. Moya Bailey of Northeastern University. We speak to Dr. Bailey about the hashtag TransformDH movement and Misogynoir in medicine. The DigitalKS podcast is produced by the University of Kansas and the Institute for Digital Research and the Humanities, IDRH for short. Thank you for listening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of DigitalKS, a podcast about all things digital humanities. Joining us from Northeastern University is Dr. Moya Bailey. Dr. Bailey, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And just to begin, I'd like to start with a discussion about your research interests and your academic history and just how you came to adopting or taking on the research that you've been conducting over the years. And what that moment was like when you just finally decided that what you're doing now is what you wanted to do.
Yeah. So I came into digital humanities through digital activism that I was already engaged in. So I was part of a few women of color groups that had been using digital technology that existed to challenge some representations of themselves and to advocate for other issues more globally. So people were using Twitter and hashtags to respond to racist or sexist imagery. People were using YouTube to create videos and web series that, challenged the way things were represented in popular culture. And I was also involved in a conference called the Allied Media Conference that takes place in Detroit every summer, or it did at the time. And through my involvement with that, I really started to think about how the digital activism I was doing overlapped with some of my scholarly interests. And also, while I was a graduate student, there was something called That Camp, which was the technology, humanities, academic, I don't know what the last T is. But That Camp was an opportunity for people who were interested in using digital tools in their scholarship to meet up for an unconference. And so the format was really fun. So an unconference allows you to gather with a group of people and you build the schedule right there. What is it that people want to learn? So it was through That Camp that I learned how to use some digital tools that I had never encountered before. So one of those was Skillshare, which was a digital platform created by the Library of Congress that no longer exists. Omeka. All of these things were tools that people taught each other through these That Camps. And then I started to organize some, and I was thinking, oh, wow, this is very much connected to the digital activism that I've already been doing. And so digital humanities gave me a way to connect that activism with my scholarship.
Nice. You mentioned unconferences. I haven't heard of those before. What are those?
So the way an unconference works is you have a group of people who come together. You have your general conference time, say 9 to 5. But in the morning, you all work out what it is the conference will actually discuss. And it's based on the skills that people bring and the topics that people want to hear. So you actually do a voting system. And you say, actually, I'd like to learn about X, or I'd like to teach X. And then through a process of voting and collaborative decision-making, you actually create the schedule together, what will happen in the conference. So for digital humanities, that really gave people an opportunity to hone in on the things that they wanted to learn and allowed people who had skills to bring those to a group in a non-lecture style format. So you actually got to workshop and play with the different tools that people were teaching. So I really liked that model. And that camp lasted, I think, had Mellon funding for about maybe 10 years. And then the funding is gone, but I think people are still doing those unconferences in that spirit today.
Because when you mentioned it, I was thinking of, because I've heard recently researchers are trying to use Twitter for conferences, to have conferences over Twitter. And I was wondering if it happened over a digital platform, if it also, or if it took place more so in person.
Yes. So the cool thing about that camps were most of the people were engaged and coming to this through their digital interests. So there were Twitter hashtags for every session. People would create Google Docs. There's actually a massive archive of some of these old that camps and the digital documents that people created as a result of those sessions that people can readily access through Google Documents.
Cool. One of the suggestions that, so I guess I noticed in reading that passage or that entry into debates in digital humanities, the suggestion, one of the suggestions for transforming DH included making it more political. Can you break down what is meant by that, and what are some ways that researchers can put that into their research and their practices?
Yeah, I think I come from a tradition in the humanities that there is no objectivity, and that the idea that our work is neutral, even as digital humanists, is incorrect. So for me, making it political is more acknowledging that fact and making that more visible in the work that we do. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything different. It just means that you're acknowledging the set of positions and ideas that inform the kind of digital scholarship you pursue. So for me, that means I'm very interested in work that addresses questions of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and that's central to the work that I'm doing and the kind of platforms that I want to engage. And it allows me to ask questions about digital tools that sometimes I think when we imagine tools as neutral that we might miss. So my latest project that I'm working on is looking at some of the issues with the supply chain for digital hardware. So it's the case that a lot of the minerals that power our smart devices, our computers, are mined by children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And through that child labor, we're able to do our digital humanities work. So I'm trying to ask, what responsibility do we have as digital humanists to think about how the human is also part of the supply chain that helps make the tools that we use to do our work? And is there a responsibility on the part of digital humanists to consider that as a focus of study? So I'm trying to get digital humanists to imagine themselves not as neutral parties, but as people who are part of a global economy and system who have unique ability to push back on the invisibility of certain people who are part of the apparatus that creates the digital things that we use.
I guess you find that traditional digital humanities and digital humanities research has it been slow to take that on, or do you see the field moving more and more in that direction?
Yeah, I see the field moving more and more in that direction. One thing that happened when I was coming up in kind of the early days of digital humanist conversation, there was a real distinction between hack and yak. So there was a way that people thought, well, if you're not doing something, if you're not making, if you're not learning how to code, then are you really a digital humanist? And there was a bit of a complaint on the side of folks who were more invested in what are we doing, what are we making, on the part, some concerns about the fact that some of us were more interested in talking and talking about, what are the political implications of the things that we're making? Why are we making them? What is this need to produce? Digital tools are helpful, but to what extent are we using these digital tools to create a better reality for humanity, which is, again, I think has a lot to do with how you understand your work in the world and your work as a scholar. And so these different threads, hack versus yak, were part of a moment in digital humanities where there was some tension. But I think that language has long, not long, I mean, it's only been a couple of years, but in the digital space, things move so quickly. But that language has shifted.
Cool. And I think that's the complaint or the criticism you raised or that you brought up about what are we producing. It seems to be a general criticism of the humanities, I think, from other fields. Like, what are we producing? What do humanists produce other than articles that talk about abstract objects or and so it seems like does DH and DH scholarship provide a sort of answer to those criticisms for humanists?
I think so. I mean, for me, I find the digital humanities exciting because it is concerned with what we're making. Even as I'm critiquing making without thinking, which I think was the initial criticism that was launched, there's something very powerful about giving students tools to do their humanities work and make the kind of arguments that might be compelling to other disciplines. So you can say that, I'm thinking about Lauren Klein's work, which is kind of my go-to example of what the digital humanities can do. She's looking at Thomas Jefferson's archive, and she can look at the importance of James Hemings, who was one of the enslaved people who worked for Thomas Jefferson, who he sent to cooking school, and also the sibling of Sally Hemings. And his importance in the Jefferson archive really could not be assessed without using a digital script to kind of cull through these thousands of pages of digitized documents. I mean, just trying to do that process by hand would be overwhelming and not something anyone would want to do. But digital humanities allows her to create a script and find all instances of his mention in the archive, and then you start to see the importance of the Hemings to Thomas Jefferson in a new way. And that really, I think, shows the utility of digital tools to answer humanities questions that otherwise might be too onerous to take on. I think that's one of the things that digital humanities provides.
In the initial criticism or the initial suggestion that DH become more political is part of a movement called #TransformDH. What is the current, one, could you tell us a little bit more about that movement, and then what is the current state of the movement?
Yeah, so TransformDH started out as folks who were involved in the digital humanities who felt like these questions of race and gender justice weren't really coming to the fore in the digital humanities materials that were central to the conversation. So definitely questions of race and gender have always been a part of digital humanities, but in the big umbrella, the big tent of DH, these things were definitely on the periphery. So part of Transform DH was trying to move those things more centrally to the concern of digital humanists. And part of that included just acknowledging the ways that whiteness was showing up in terms of how people were thinking about digital humanities generally. And I think that we were good instigators. I think as graduate students, most of us were graduate students and junior scholars. We had a sort of fearlessness and naivete that allowed us to propose and suggest new ways of thinking about digital projects. And for me, my connection to Transform DH has largely been one of still running its Tumblr. There's a Tumblr for Transform DH, and part of that has been including projects that might not be recognized as digital humanities projects. So looking at the digital work that people are doing in community, not necessarily connected to a university, but saying, actually, that's digital humanities. And so part of that is widening the umbrella of who counts in DH, and that there are lots of people in other academic disciplines who might not use the language of digital humanities, despite the fact that that's the work that they're doing. So one example of this, I had a colleague, Carla Stokes, who did an incredible project, and this is like in the early nascent days of Facebook, back when MySpace was still popular and people were making their own websites. So there was a moment where people were creating their own websites with HTML, pre-WordPress, etc. And she had a collection or a connection to a bunch of young Black women, young Black girls, middle school and high schoolers who had created their own websites. And she was looking at this work and trying to figure out how they were understanding themselves, how they were using these sites to make connections with each other, to challenge certain representations of young Black girls. And in the process, she ended up creating her own site that she invited the girls to participate in, which was a little bit safer than just being online and dealing with harassing comments. So I really saw her work as instrumental in very much digital humanities, but because that wasn't the language of her discipline, that isn't how she understood herself, she might not be counted as a digital humanist. So part of my work with the Tumblr site was including people who might not be recognized or legible to digital humanities, but are still doing that work.
Got it. And part of the movement was, I guess because you mentioned earlier this sort of Twitter activism, and I think that you note in one of your articles that at first glance, or when people first hear of any sort of activism taking place on social media, it's not taken all that seriously, in part because they have some, I guess, built-in skepticism about how effective social media can be in terms of activism. What has been your experience in social media activism?
Yeah. So I just completed a book with two colleagues, Sarah Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells, called #Activism. And we look at some of the major hashtags related to race and gender justice and how they have been instrumental in creating opportunities for communities to speak back to power, that these hashtags had material effects. And one of those hashtags would be the hashtag Trayvon Martin, which was very effective in finally getting the sheriff's office in Florida to actually indict George Zimmerman. Before there was a push, before there was a movement, George Zimmerman had not been indicted or arrested. Mm-hmm. And so that was, I think, very much connected to the Twitter and on-the-ground activism that people were involved with. And I think, too, there's a misunderstanding that Twitter activism is somehow separate and apart from the activism that people are doing on the ground. And so many of these activists use Twitter in connection with their on-the-ground organizing. So our book really shows that people are using Twitter, using it as a tool, hashtags as a tool to aid on-the-ground organizing that they are also involved in. And it brings new people who had perhaps never considered themselves activists before to a conversation that they might not have participated in otherwise. The foreword for the book is by Jeannie Lauren, and Jeannie Lauren is significant because following Zimmerman's acquittal, there was a juror who was going to have a book deal with a publisher. Oh. And Jeannie was saying, that doesn't seem right that you would profit off the death of Trayvon Martin. And successfully through Twitter, in less than 24 hours of knowing this, she was able to get people to put enough pressure on the editor that the contract was dropped. And so I think that's just one more testament to the power of Twitter to really move conversations and change material realities, right? You shouldn't profit off the death of Trayvon Martin and your participation in this jury. And enough people through Twitter felt that that was the case, that the contract was dropped. And so I think we've seen this over and over, that Twitter can be really instrumental in having direct impact fairly quickly with corporations and people who are in positions of power.
And have you seen, the effectiveness of these sort of movements improve as more and more people understand how to, use that leverage into as they improve and develop their knowledge about how social media works? And
I think it's shifting. I was actually thinking about this in relationship to the aging of Twitter's demographics. Mm-hmm. So, you think about Facebook. Facebook started out as only being for college students, and now anyone can use it. So the demographics of Facebook have definitely aged. You won't find a lot of young people on Facebook, and now you're finding less young people on Twitter. So I think the way that people are using it is shifting because the demographics are shifting. I think that we will find another tool and that people will continue to use Twitter as they see fit. But I do think that the changing demographics of social media platforms is definitely shaping the kinds of activism that people are involved in.
And briefly, I want to discuss, I think, a term that you, or a concept that you're speaking about here on campus in relation to medicine. I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but
give it a shot.
The concept, Misogynoir.
Yes.
Could you speak to a little bit about that concept and what led to its development?
Yeah. So my dissertation was on an old form of social media. I was actually looking at medical school yearbooks, and I was trying to figure out how medical students understood race, and using the yearbooks as a proxy for kind of their own thoughts and feelings because it's something they create themselves. It's not something that their professors have anything to do with. So it became a window into how they were thinking about race and gender at this moment that medical schools become the way we understand them today. So 4-year institutions, very much invested in science and medicine, an educational experience that is pretty much only accessible to people who have money. All of that starts around 1910 after a very influential report called the Flexner Report, in which Abraham Flexner went to every medical school in the U.S. and Canada and kind of evaluated them on their ability to produce, well-trained physicians. And in that process, a bunch of medical schools were closed. The structure of medical education shifted, and race and gender were obviously a very important part of how medical doctors were understanding themselves and understanding their patients. And I kept seeing Black women come up in these medical in the medical literature. So whether it was a textbook or in these yearbooks, I would find Black women, which was interesting because Black women weren't really allowed to be doctors, and so they weren't students, and they also were so far removed from the typical doctor being white and male. So I was trying to figure out what was this tension there, and there was something about Black women as like the antithesis of the medical student that made them a source of derision and also a space for young medical doctors to feel like they had some understanding of their subject. They had something over the patients, in the sense that Black women as patients were considered not very smart, not educated, completely dependent on these doctors to help them. And so when they're already feeling a little bit insecure because they're in medical schools and the teachers are constantly berating them for their lack of knowledge, Black women become a very helpful foil for making them feel as though they do have some mastery and some ownership over their knowledge of medicine. And I noticed that there was a unique way that Black women were targeted that did not match the way white women were treated in these texts or the way Black men were treated in these texts. And I also was thinking about Black women's representation in popular culture. So it got me to thinking about what is it about Black women specifically that makes them this unique target of animus. And that's where I started thinking about Misogynoir. So in relationship to medicine, but also in relationship to media. And so that's kind of been what has driven my work. Why are Black women so uniquely positioned as this special case, this special group of people who receive so much venom from all different groups of people? And that venom is particularly effective and useful within medicine. And what I mean by that is Black women's bodies have been used to develop different medical procedures, practices that have not actually benefited Black women. So we can think about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells have been used to develop all kinds of different vaccines, but her cells were taken without her consent and knowledge. Her family still is dealing with a lot of residual fallout as it relates to systemic racism and systemic sexism as it impacts their family. But Johns Hopkins has benefited very much from the use of HeLa cells, and those cells are still sold at different medical institutions around the country. And then we can look at the reality for Black women's health and see that despite generating all of this helpful medical knowledge, Black women's health outcomes don't really match their utility to the medical community. So Black women still suffer disparate rates of negative health outcomes despite their use in medical research. And so to me, that's one of those examples of how Misogynoir actually shows up within medicine and in society.
And besides the work the project that you started on this topic, are there any other movements or sort of directed stories directed stories and movements that are happening around this very topic?
Yeah, so I'm part of a collective called the Black Feminist Health Science Studies Group. And so all of us come from different disciplines. Some of us are medical practitioners. One is a PhD, MD student. People are differently connected to aspects of medicine, both in the U.S. and Canada. And our goal is to try and think of collaborative research and interdisciplinary research that kind of can try to ameliorate some of these negative impacts on Black women's health. What kind of projects are possible if we're coming at it from our different perspectives, our different disciplinary backgrounds?
And just as we bring our conversation to a close, wondering if you could speak briefly, because some of our listeners may be humanists who haven't engaged with digital humanities, or might be curious about what digital humanities might, how it might benefit their own research. Do you have any advice that you could share with them about how to get involved or how to begin a DH project?
Yes, I would definitely say look around your campus and see if there's any DH initiative that's happening at your institution. And connecting with people directly, I think, is a lot more helpful than trying to find something online. I would also suggest talking to your librarians, because librarians tend to be sometimes one of the first lines of contact for digital humanities. And I would encourage people to just think about what digital tools are interesting to them and see if there's a community of scholars who are thinking about that or using it. You might have some interest in a topic, but you might not know if digital humanities is being used in that regard. And so I might even suggest, doing a search of scholarly articles that are related to your field that also might include digital humanities so that you can reach out to people who are doing that work. I think for me, digital humanities is such a collaborative experience that it's helpful to meet people and connect with individuals as opposed to trying to learn the history of this very messy field and get embroiled in all of the debates, and the Twitter conversations can be quite overwhelming. So having someone to kind of guide you into that world would be helpful.
Well, Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for joining us and allowing us to have such a wonderful conversation about your work and the particular aspect of digital humanities.
Oh, well, thank you for having me again.
And thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for future episodes of DigiTalks.